SpaceX satellites crash after magnetic storm. Bad day at science. A tremendous geomagnetic solar storm crushed the SpaceX satellites. If things go on like this solar storm will take all the space experiments to a halt. Artificial satellites will be crashed, disrupting all worldly internet systems. But why did such a problem arise all of a sudden? And how can we get rid of it? Well, in today's video, we will take a look at SpaceX's satellites crash after a geomagnetic storm, which badly affected a lot of satellites of SpaceX. Hey everyone, welcome back to Tech United, the most trusted channel for all things related to Elon Musk and technology. To join our community, click the like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to press the bell symbol to never miss an update. So without any further ado, let's get started. The most recent Starlink launch by SpaceX did not go as planned, according to a press statement issued recently. 40 of the 49 satellites deployed will most certainly be lost. That's more than 80% of satellites that will deorbit in the following days if they haven't already. And it's all due to a deadly solar flare that they didn't predict the impacts of. So indeed, Starlink Group 47 launched on February 3 and completed the weight of the southerly course, where they must conduct this dogleg maneuver after passing through the Bahamas. Once the second stage is deployed, the first stage lands on a barge, which had its issues with recovery, but it appears to be making its way back to port safely. As a result, they ascend into orbit. They first placed it in a low orbit, around 330 by 220 kilometers, and then randomly released the satellites. They do this to keep the amount of hardware required to a minimum. As a result, the satellites are spread out slowly into orbit and given time to disperse before turning on their ion thrusters to lift their orbit into their targeted orbits. They were in the middle of a magnetic solar storm when they got into orbit, and solar storms happen all the time, and they normally affect satellites in far higher orbits, not Starlink, which is deep within the magnetosphere. However, there are a lot of charged particles that fly off the sun at very high energy that can impact delicate electronics within satellites beyond the magnetosphere. They can generate single-bit errors, which can corrupt data, force processors to reset, and cause computer hardware outside of the magnetospheres to be more hardened than that deeper inside the magnetosphere. When you look at the International Space Station, you'll see that they employ consumer-grade technologies that are mostly unmodified. We've seen astronauts use iPads, and several astronauts have also used their iPhones and Inspiration 4s, even Apple Watches, which have a little processor, operate properly since they are deep within the magnetosphere and thus safe from magnetic storms. That, however, was not the issue. The primary issue is that a solar flare is an extremely powerful event that releases a lot of energy, not only in the form of radiation, but also in the form of a straight-up black body thermal spectrum. A lot of additional UV radiation raises the sun's luminance by a few percent, and all that extra light, heat, and radiation may heat the upper atmosphere, causing it to expand outwards. The thermosphere is the name given to the upper atmosphere, up to 600 kilometers. This is above the carbon line. Isn't this the part of the atmosphere that's mostly made up of dissociated atoms? The major ingredients are oxygen and nitrogen, both of which are monatomic. Because they're monatomic and don't collide very often, they're not particularly adept at releasing whatever energy they get. However, as they gain energy from dissociation, they tend to linger around, because it is substantially hotter than the layers under the mesosphere, the thermosphere, and this implies that as the brightness of the sun varies rapidly, the density of this atmosphere may alter, causing us to expand outwards when it gets a little more energy and then contract inwards, all on a time scale of hours. As a result, when SpaceX launched their satellites, they discovered that they were passing through a thicker atmosphere. It was nearly 50% denser than any prior Starlink launch that has been recorded. While they waited for the air density to decrease, they decided to place the satellites into their safe mode. So they simply spin the flat satellites sideways and don't let them cruise through the atmosphere, reducing drag while they wait for things to shift. However, when they attempted to shift them out of this phase, they experienced some difficulties. They needed to be able to change their orientation, and they did so via magnet arches and reaction fields, which aren't especially powerful, except in the lower atmosphere. They're competing for items in space's vacuum. There's just enough drag to overpower Starlink's reaction fields and magnet arches, preventing them from turning into orientation properly to deploy their solar panels and begin rising their orbits. That means they've plummeted and aren't going to be able to get out of this since they can't boost their orbit. We've seen around 40 out of 49 satellites that wouldn't be able to make it to space or higher orbits, where they might truly become operational. So SpaceX stated that it demonstrates SpaceX is a worthy patron and steward of low Earth orbits. If their spacecraft is launched and they discover technical issues immediately, they will deorbit as fast as possible. This is unquestionably correct. However, it was not the point of SpaceX's demonstration. They wanted their satellites to go into orbit and start working. This is one of the lowest insertions we've seen in recent years, which is fascinating. So while this launch saw circumstances 50% greater than any other previous Starlink flights, we are still a long way from the significant solar maximum. They may have to opt to put them into somewhat higher orbits in the future launches to avoid these high drag scenarios. Over the next several years, we'll observe changes in the Sun, which will result in a denser upper atmosphere. It reminds me of something that occurred to Skylab. Skylab was launched and left in orbit with the expectation that the space shuttle would be able to propel it to a higher orbit once it was operational. However, because of a higher orbit with a more intense solar maximum than expected, the Earth's atmosphere ballooned outwards and increased drag, leading the Skylab to sink and deorbit before the space station could be built. Of course, the fact is that NASA just took a long time to get the space shuttle up and running. As a result, in the approaching years, they'll have to tolerate increasing atmospheric concentrations. As a result, they'll most likely raise their insertion orbits to accommodate for this. To be able to follow this southern path and escape the severe waves in the North Atlantic, they had to lose several satellites. However, they'll likely have to sacrifice a couple more satellites to increase the orbit high enough to avoid this and future launches. That will be interesting to see. So certainly the idea that the outer atmosphere is wholly driven by solar activity is an intriguing aspect of this. Local weather has little effect since it is nearly totally dissociated from the lower atmosphere. It's possible that the eruption in Tonga disrupted the upper atmosphere. It'll be fascinating to see whether that has an impact, except that long-term climate change appears to be shrinking the mesosphere, so the mesosphere and thermosphere lie on top of the lower stratosphere. And increasing thermal absorption, particularly infrared absorption, means that more heat remains in the lower atmosphere. As a result, the upper layers of the atmosphere get colder and decrease as the Earth's atmosphere warms. It's projected that the thermosphere and mesosphere will become less thick. As a result, satellites will take longer to deorbit. This specific occurrence has nothing to do with climate change. Let's be clear about it. This is essentially the solar atmosphere with the sun acting erratically and throwing a slew of high-energy photons that are heating things, and SpaceX finding itself with a slew of satellites that can't seem to get out of this mess. It's not even that the low-thrust engines didn't have enough thrust. It's the fact that they couldn't even rotate from their safety to their orbit-raising position. Rather than xenon thrusters, SpaceX uses krypton thrusters. This is a design in which they employ significantly less expensive propellants in return for a lower price. But it's possible that if they could move out of this orientation, they'd be able to lift their orbits if they had more powerful thrust engines. Nonetheless, this is a very difficult matter that must be resolved as soon as possible. With that stated, we've concluded today's video. Give the video a thumbs up if you found it interesting and informative. Let us know what you think of this satellite crash due to the magnetic solar storm in the comments box. How fatal do you think it can be? Share your view with us. And to be notified whenever we upload new videos, subscribe to the channel and enable the notification bell. We'll see you in the next one. Until then, peace.